blessed humility, blessed justice, and then today we're talking about blessed peacemaking. Peacemaking is something that is important not just to anyone from an Anabaptist or from a Mennonite tradition, but for anyone who's looking to follow in the way of Jesus. Peacemaking as something different than peacekeeping. We'll get to talk about that today because we're looking at Jesus' collection of his best message, or probably something he spoke all and gave all at once, this Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7, where he talks at the beginning in the Beatitudes about these different blessings. So what does blessed mean? Well, in some of our Bibles it will say happy. That's a good way you can do it. It can mean there's wonderful news for these people. It could mean that the people who are like this are a part of Jesus' kingdom. In the Old Testament, when we see the word blessed, it also has this implication of being wise. Wise are those. Those who are blessed are also empowered by God. In some ways, God is empowering them and with them to enable them to be this way. But perhaps the easiest way that I would have to look at it, whenever you see blessed are in Matthew, is to look at it as God's favor is upon. These are people who God's favor is upon as they are these ways. These character traits they have. And they are blessed. God's favor is on them, not just for their own sake, but they're blessed with a purpose. And that purpose is a part of God's kingdom. So, today we get to talk about blessed peacemaking. Now, God's kingdom is something that can be a little confusing for us, and this is something Jesus talks about. In Matthew, he calls it the kingdom of heaven, because Jesus' kingdom, Jesus' understanding of reality will look upside down compared to how we look at it. Like the show Stranger Things on Netflix, this fantasy science fiction show where there's everyone living in a normal world, but underneath the normal world, there is this dark, twisted reality that mirrors our world in a dark way. And kind of in the same way, Jesus is saying that we live in a similar reality, except we live in the upside down. We live in this dark, twisted reality, this creation that was good, twisted by sin. That everything the way it is now is upside down. So Jesus invites us to see the world as he sees it, to see it upside down. To turn ourselves around and start to see things as Jesus sees them and as God intends to make them again. Because Jesus is an upside-down kind of king. The kind of king who doesn't rule over people with power, but wears a crown of thorns, who goes to the cross even for his enemies and forgives them, who goes and lifts up the least of these in his midst. This upside-down living is what Jesus invites us into, to live out these values, to become these types of values as we follow his way. This is, as we just prayed this morning, the emphasis of thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, that we get to be a part of making that kingdom come through our lives and by our prayers. So today we look at what it would be for Jesus' peace to come. God's peace to come here on earth as it is in heaven. This blessed peacemaking. So a little background before we go into Matthew 5, verse 9. Right at the beginning of Matthew 5, we see that there's this crowd of people following Jesus, and it says that Jesus sees the crowd. He is aware of the type of people who are following him, and he sees them for who they are and loves them there. Jesus goes up on this mountainside giving these images of Moses bringing these commandments, and Jesus sits down to level the playing field, to teach people calmly and peacefully, teaching his disciples first, who are the closest, but also this multitude of people who have come to hear what he has to say. First, Jesus talks about blessed are those who embody humility. Blessed are those who embody God's justice. And then the last three that we look at today, blessed are those who embody God's peacemaking. So let's look through Matthew 5, 9 through 12. I'll have some images alongside here. Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you. It's the first time he says that. When people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Okay, let's dig a little deeper into this richness of Jesus' teaching. So Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. There is an active component to bringing peace. Peace isn't just something that happens on its own. Peace isn't just something that we're able to keep. It's something that has to be made. Peacemaking is an active entrance into the middle of conflict for the purpose of creating reconciliation and peace. The purpose of creating peace where there wasn't before. Or as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King says, true peace is not merely the absence of tension. It is the presence of justice. The presence of God's justice. And in our confession of faith, it says, led by the Holy Spirit, we follow Christ in the way of peace, doing justice, bringing reconciliation, and practicing non-resistance, even in the face of violence and warfare. Because that's what Jesus calls us to. And Jesus says those who are peacemakers will be called the children of God. Children are in the likeness of their parents. My children are in the likeness of me in this picture. They did not get that silly on their own. It is genetically passed down to them. For better or for worse as well sometimes. And that is what Jesus is saying. If you are a peacemaker, you are starting to show the likeness of who God the Father is. And in fact, if you are God's children, then you will naturally be peacemakers. Because that is who God is. And as we are his children, we will go and show that reflection of his nature, of his peacemaking in how we live. And then Jesus talks about people who are persecuted because of righteousness. This isn't a self-righteousness, right, where we go and we kind of prop ourselves up against others. Righteousness, as we learned, is this working for being in peace with God, with the people around us. It's this working to bring about God's justice in our midst. Living justly, doing justly, loving mercy, walking humbly. And this passage is different than the rest of what Jesus has said. He says, blessed are you. He's turning this around now, and he is very clearly speaking to the people who are there. And he says, blessed are you when, not if, when you are persecuted because of me. When you're persecuted, when things go poorly for you, when the world treats you poorly, because you are loving like Jesus. See, Jesus isn't selling people on this la-di-da false hope of follow me and everything goes well. Jesus knows where peacemaking will take him. And he knows that inviting people to follow him involves denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and embodying his love. He knows this pathway is hard. And so he's saying, as you follow this path, it will be hard, but you will be blessed because of it. When you are persecuted for seeking God's justice and righteousness. When you're persecuted for following and associating with Jesus. The trouble that we have is that peace can seem a bit elusive to us. What does peace even mean? What kind of peace are we talking about? Because our imaginations are so shaped by the world, we can't imagine peace coming by any other means than by violence. What happens when the superheroes encounter the supervillains in the super big movies? Do they just walk on over, turn the other cheek, and love their enemies? No, there's this big battle that ensues. In almost all of our creative imagination as people, it always comes that peace is made through violence. Peace is made through force. In this picture, there's a picture of a gun right there called a peacemaker. We as Canadians send soldiers overseas with guns and call them peacemakers. Peace is made through violence in our collective imagination as humankind. And if we're honest and we start to think about peace within our communities, within our midst, we prefer to keep the peace. We prefer to not stir things up. If there's an absence of peace, we kind of say, well, maybe both sides were wrong and we just want to stay quiet and keep things normal, instead of entering in and helping the imbalance be balanced again. When we go and we keep the peace, we actually start to embrace injustice in our midst. We start to lift up those who are treating others poorly, instead of standing like Jesus on behalf of those who are the least of these. And if we're honest, we know deep down that peacemaking has a price. Peacemaking like Jesus has a price. We just quoted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who people love to quote and take out of context, but the reality is he challenged the empire of America, this empire faith that embodied violence, militarism, and injustice. And he was killed for it, for radically speaking the truth to make peace. There's something about being a Christian, maybe more so today than ever before, where we have a bit of a complex of persecution. We think people are persecuting us when they respond to the way we've treated them. Like, well, we're just speaking our truth. Well, why are they persecuting me? Why are they persecuting? As opposed to the persecution that we see happen to the early church, the first followers of Jesus. As we see in the history of Mennonites and Anabaptists, where following Jesus' persecution will sometimes mean we take on violence to ourselves. Where sometimes following Jesus will mean that those following the empire faith will see you as a heretic because they said the same about Jesus. But Jesus' message and his embodiment of peacemaking is one of hope. Because we see in the life of Jesus that he was a peacemaker, inviting others to follow his peacemaking ways. Jesus is one who, as he makes peace, he knows what it's like to endure persecution. He knows what it's like to endure that even on behalf of his enemies. Jesus has made peace through his actions, his life, through his death and resurrection, through loving his enemies. All the powers of violence and empire and death are not overcome by a great army of angels that Jesus could have called down at any time. The powers of this world are overcome by love, by enemy love, self-sacrificing love. Peace is made at a price that Jesus was glad to pay and invites us into. Okay, so what does this mean for us? Well, blessed are you when you're persecuted for being righteous, for righteousness' sake. Will we be righteous? Will we be the kind of people who embody God's justice as we speak truth in love, as we speak truth against power? Will we enter into those places of conflict? Or will we stay at a distance? Will we make peace? As we remember those who served in wars in Canada, I wear a white poppy. And this is part of a long tradition that goes back to the beginning of Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day was a day to remember all of the people we lost, the husbands, the sons that were sent off to war and died. Mothers, sisters, women mourning the men that died. And so they would wear a poppy to remember that we were to work for peace. And very quickly, this movement of Remembrance Day is transformed in the British Empire to something that's more like a jingoism of celebrating the violence and warfare instead of working for peace. So the very same group went very early on and said, okay, if you're taking our red poppies, we will switch to a white poppy because we want to remember. This is why we started it, that to truly remember means we work for peace, not just celebrating what was lost, Not just raising things up as if these people were heroes, which maybe they were, but we want them to come home, not die heroes. Where we follow a Jesus who is able to make enemies see each other as people. Where we long for this time where whatever violence and warfare is going on in the world, it's not that one army defeats another army, that the more just army defeats the injustice brought by another army, but where the soldiers on the battlefield start to see each other as humans made in the image of God, to be loved. Friends, whose children will we be? What will our lives show? Will we be those types of peacemakers? Will we receive the blessing of Jesus so that we can be a blessing to others in our neighborhood and the world? Will we continue to ask, what would Jesus do? How would Jesus love in any situation? Will we make Jesus' kind of peace in our neighborhoods and in our world? That is what it means to be a peacemaker. May you be a blessed peacemaker.